Thank you, Henry, for the generous introduction, and thank you everyone for coming on this nice evening. When you are giving a talk in this country, the weather is the biggest enemy because sometimes it's too bad, no one wants to get out of the house. Sometimes it's too good, everyone wants to be outside, don't want to come to listen to economists talking about boring things. I'm really grateful that you have all come this evening. So as Henry said, I have been engaged in promoting economic pluralism. Basically the idea that there isn't just one way of doing economics. There are many different ways, all with their strengths and weaknesses. And I've written about many of the kind of contemporary problems of austerity, income inequality, and what have you. But my academic expertise is in development, and what I'm going to talk about today is this series of explanations about the development failures, allegedly, of developing countries that have emerged in the last few decades, which very much emphasize what I call metastructural factors. So these are not even structural in the sense of being subject to human intervention, although they change slowly and in complicated ways. So your production structure. You are today, exporting coffee, potentially you could be exporting electronics, but that transition takes a long time, but it can happen. Whereas these so-called metastructural explanations talk about things like your climate, your geography, your culture, your history, and I'm going to talk about those. But the content is its own, but that whole series of arguments actually has implications on how we approach economic evidence, how we explain economic phenomena in general. So I'll get to that later. So basically the starting point is around 1990, 95. Suddenly you had an explosion of the literature in economics, which tried to explain why Africa is not developing, why Latin America is not doing well, why developing countries in general, except for a handful of economies in East Asia, are not doing great. There was an explosion about the explanation about these phenomena in terms of basically this metastructural things. So people were talking about climate, geography, natural resources, ethnic diversity, institutions, culture. So it was argued that tropical climate is bad for economic development because it creates diseases that reduce labor productivity, raise healthcare costs, and reduce animal husbandry yields. Tropical soil leads to low agricultural yields because it's poor in nutrients. It's a bit of a complicated story, but some people have even claimed that tropical climate is linked to low quality institutions. It's a bit of a kind of convoluted argument, but basically the argument is that how economies are doing today is very much determined by the quality of institutions like the legal system and so on that the countries have. And those institutions were put in place essentially hundreds of years ago through the colonial process in most developing countries. And then this the Turkish economist who teaches in MIT in America, Acemoglu, well, apparently in Turkish that is read Acemoglu, but everyone calls him Acemoglu. And no, when I met him and asked him, he said, "Yeah, it is Acemoglu, but everyone calls me Acemoglu, so I'm Acemoglu." Yeah? Anyway, so he and his co-authors argue that basically the climate in today's developing countries, former colonies, determine what kind of institutions they got. Yeah? Because when the climate is hospitable to European colonizers like North America, Australia, New Zealand, they wanted to live there and brought the good institutions like rule of law and democracy and things like that with them, because they have to live there. Whereas in Africa, in many parts of Asia and Latin America, climate was very hostile, a lot of tropical diseases. Yeah? And that to show that they looked at this old mortality statistics. Yeah? And yeah, in those countries, these people just wanted to come and extract resource and go back home. Yeah? So they didn't bring good institutions, just the minimal, yeah, kind of the stuff related to law and order stuff. Yeah? And that experience basically determined how countries are doing today. Yeah? This is a bit of a convoluted story, but it kind of attracted huge attention, because in doing that they also partly resolved some technical statistical problems that were involved in this debate, which I don't need to go into. People have talked about not just the climate but geography. A lot of people have pointed out there are a lot of African countries that are landlocked. Yeah? When you're landlocked, it's difficult to trade with the outside world, and that hampers economic development. People have talked about so-called bad neighborhood effects. Basically, if you are in an area surrounded by poor countries with lots of conflicts, i.e. many African countries, then you wouldn't be doing very well, even if you are okay. There's a spillover of conflict from neighbors. Yeah? Neighbors are poor, you cannot sell stuff to them. Yeah? People have also talked about natural resource curse. So that it has been argued that if you have abundant natural resource, it is actually a curse. Yeah? It creates conflicts, corruption, that leads to overvaluation of currency and so on. So, actually that these days a lot of people will say that having little natural resources is a good thing. Look at East Asian economies like Japan, Korea, they have virtually no natural resource, they've done well. Look at all these oil economies in the Middle East, the parts of Africa, Latin American countries with a lot of agricultural land, they haven't done well. So, of course, the evidence is more systematic than that. Statistical tests and so on. But this is how it is presented. People have also talked about ethnic divisions. So it has been argued that African countries, especially, are suffering from ethnic diversity. They have all these different groups, different ethnic groups who don't trust each other. This means that the exchanges are difficult. Yeah? Because when you don't trust your trading partner, you have to go a great length to ensure that that contract is observed. And so, the best, it's not about real countries, but the best example being all these kind of spy or gangster movies when they exchange hostages for money. They kind of go to the middle point, leave the bag. They send the hostage. That's very costly because they don't trust each other. Huh? So that's the analogy. Also, it has been argued that ethnic diversity encourages violent conflicts, but interestingly, the argument is that is at the middle level diversity that is the worst. Yeah. So if you have like one or two dominant groups, that there's less conflict. If you have lots of groups, it's difficult to organize them, so there's a little conflict. But if you have like 3, 4 big groups, then you are likely to have conflict. People have talked about low quality institutions. Yeah, so World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, they've been arguing that developing countries need to improve governance. Yeah, basically they need to introduce rule of law, democracy, the intellectual property rights, and what have you. And I talked about that argument of Asimoglu. People have also talked about bad culture, especially the African or the Muslim ones. So basically they argue that poor work ethic, lack of cooperation, low value put on education, lack of planning, all these things that come from people's cultural inclinations that hamper development. The best example is this quote from Samuel Huntington, who caused quite a controversy, that he's an American political scientist, by writing this book called Clash of Civilizations, and he in one of his writings compares Ghana and South Korea, which in the early 60s had similar levels of income. Actually, he's wrong there, because Ghana was twice richer than South Korea then. In 1961, Ghana's income was $190 per capita. Korea's was $90. Anyway, but he says, despite this, the two countries diverged hugely because Koreans were, basically good people, Ghanaians were not, You have some Africans themselves are saying really kind of abusive things about their fellow Africans, These people have no sense of time, no kind of planning, it's like I don't know why these are coming out so big. These are societies where it's like a football team where no one passes the ball to the other guy, I mean, you can find so many of these things, I mean, I don't need to add to that. Just read Daily Telegraph. Anyway, so we had this the profusion of these metastructural arguments, which actually I think is quite disturbing, because what are the policy implications of this? If your climate or geography is a hindrance to your development, what is the policy implication? Should, Uganda invade Norway and send the Norwegians to Uganda and live in Norway so that they can develop? I mean, if your institutions or culture is a bad thing, I mean, what do you do? I mean, do you invent the time machine, go back and put your ancestors into some kind of concentration camp to re-educate them, No, actually, this basically means that some countries are destined to underdevelop. So it has very disturbing implications. But apart from that, I would say that all these arguments are very misleading, if not entirely wrong. And I'm going to go through them to show how these arguments need to be scrutinized in a very, very critical way, because when you think about it, these are the assumptions that are behind many of our policy discussions today. So developing countries basically need to be helped because they have no hope. Yeah, I mean that's the good people. Yeah, bad people will say, you know, whatever you do, these countries will never develop because they got wrong culture, wrong climate, wrong geography. Why are you wasting money? Yeah, 0.7%. Yeah, commitment. That's nonsense. You're just putting the money down the drain. Yeah. So let's look at this one by one to see how problematic they are. First of all, climate. You know, why is it only tropical climate that is bad for economic development? Yeah? No, think about the frigid and Arctic climates that you find in Canada, part of the USA, Finland, Sweden, Norway. You know, these are very bad for the economy too. You know. I mean, in winter in these countries, it's minus 30, 40, 50 degrees. Yeah, there's a huge heating cost. Yeah, machines seize up. You know, the lubricants don't work. Yeah. People cannot work outside for a long time. Yeah? It's a huge hindrance. Yeah? And many of these countries that used to be landlocked, well, part of the time because once the sea freezes, yeah, for 6 months they cannot get to the sea. Yeah? So until they invented the ice-breaking ships in the late 19th century, you know, countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, they were half of the year landlocked, you know, which is supposed to be bad for the economic development. You know? So actually there's no obvious a priori reason to believe that cold climate is better than hot climate. You know? And I have a great authority behind this the observation, Aristotle. Huh? He said Asians live in a hot place. That makes them clever but very cowardly. Yeah? Europeans live in a cold place. That makes them brave but stupid. Greece, we have the perfect climate. Not too cold, not too hot. Yeah? Yeah, it really depends on how you look at it. Yeah? We don't even think of cold climate as an inhibiting factor for development when we are talking about countries like, I don't know, Sweden or Canada, only because these countries have acquired, through economic development, the money and the technologies to deal with it. Yeah? The same point can actually be applied to tropical diseases. You know, many of today's rich countries, not just Singapore, which is bang on the equator, more or less, yeah, they used to have huge problems with the tropical diseases, at least part of the year. Yeah? Southern Italy, southern USA, South Korea, you know, these countries used to have a huge malaria epidemic during the summer. You know? Of course, we don't even think that malaria ever was a hindrance to economic development of the US or Singapore, because these countries have the money, have the medical technology, yeah, have the organization to, well, not completely, but more or less eradicate these diseases, yeah, so that they don't matter anymore. So basically, a lot of this climate argument is confusing the cause and the effect of economic development. Yeah? So it's not that they don't develop because of tropical climate. It's that they have problem dealing with the consequences of this tropical climate because they haven't developed their economies. Yeah? Similarly with geography, you know, several the rich countries are landlocked. Yeah? Switzerland, Austria. Yeah? how did they develop? As I mentioned earlier, the Scandinavian countries and parts of Canada and the US were effectively landlocked during winter because of the cold climate. Also, experiences of individual developing countries today defy this story. The two of the fastest growing economies in Africa at the moment, well, in the last, say, 20 years, Ethiopia and Rwanda, these are both landlocked. And very interestingly, Ethiopia started growing faster after becoming landlocked when Eritrea seceded after an internal war in 1991, or was it 92, thereabout, So the Eritrea had all the coastline, that country that became separate, and Ethiopia became landlocked, and then it started growing faster. Also, Uzbekistan is a very interesting country. It's the only double landlocked country in the world. You have to go through two countries before you can get to the sea. So by this theory, it should be the worst economy in the world. Actually, it is the fastest, has been in the last 20 years, the fastest growing former Soviet republic. How did that happen? Well, once again, the point is that, of course, there are many alternatives to sea transport. There's a river transport, rail, road. For example, Ethiopia, after becoming landlocked, did a deal with this small country called Djibouti, and basically use that port to export things to the outside world. Many landlocked African countries have huge potentials for river transport, but then in order to have that, you need dredging, you need canals. They don't have money to do that. These days that air transport is becoming quite important because a lot of things that are exported are actually quite light, like certain electronic parts, flowers, and so on. A lot of things are airlifted, so being landlocked is not such a limitation. Once again, these arguments are mixing the cause and the effect. These countries seem to be they are suffering from the consequences of being landlocked because they are economically underdeveloped and not the other way around. As for the bad neighbor effect, you don't have to sell to your neighbors. You can always export to other countries. The East Asian countries basically grew by exporting to the US and Europe. 5,000-6,000 miles away. India and Bangladesh are in a bad neighborhood in the sense that South Asia is actually at the moment the poorest region in the world. It's actually poorer than Africa. And the region doesn't lack conflicts, continuous confrontation and occasional war between India and Pakistan, Naxalite guerrillas in India, civil war in Nepal, you name it. Despite that, these countries have done well. Similar story with natural resources. Well, first of all, many of these studies use the wrong measures because they are mixing basically natural resource dependence with natural resource abundance, yeah, because they usually look at the export statistics and say that, oh, this country exports a lot of minerals, yeah. Yes, maybe in relative terms, yeah, but in absolute terms, they haven't got much. Yeah? So actually, in Africa, only a few countries can be described as being well endowed with mineral resources. Yeah? So basically, South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, they have a lot of mineral resources. Yeah? And then you have a few oil economies like Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon. But apart from that, African countries actually don't have much mineral resources. Yeah? They look like they have a lot because they have nothing else to sell, and therefore, 85%, 90% of their exports are minerals. Yeah? Also, many rich countries have successfully used natural resource abundance as springboards for their economic development. US, Canada, Australia, these countries are very, very well endowed with mineral resources, much more actually than South Africa or the DRC. In Australia, you don't even have to dig ground to get coal. Yeah? They have these open cast mines. Yeah? Just get rid of the topsoil and there's the coal. Yeah? South Africans have to dig 3,000 meters to get to coal and gold. Yeah? Indeed, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the natural resource-rich countries of North America, South America, and Scandinavia were the fastest growing regions in the world. As for ethnic diversity, well, many of today's rich countries in Europe have suffered from ethnic and other divisions. Belgium, Switzerland, Spain. Belgium has 2 groups. Yeah, Switzerland have 3.5 groups. Yeah, Spain, the Catalans. Yeah. Anyway, don't need to go into that, but. These countries do not lack these things. In explaining the so-called economic miracle of the East Asian economies, a lot of people have emphasized ethnic homogeneity, but this is very wrong. Of course, I know that we all look the same. The Korean, the Chinese. Don't worry. We return the compliments by calling all Caucasians Americans in Korea. So, but when you actually go deeper, these societies are not that homogeneous. Yeah? China, they are united by this particular writing system that is semantic rather than phonetic. But in terms of spoken languages, someone from Guangdong doesn't understand someone from Shanghai or Beijing. Yeah? Japan has a lot of ethnic minorities, although not huge in numbers, including Koreans. Taiwan, it has 2 main ethnic groups, the so-called Taiwanese, who are descendants of the migrants from Southeast China, mainly Fujian province, and the so-called mainlanders, the northerners who came with the nationalist government after its defeat by the communists in 1949. Yeah? Korea, arguably is one of the most ethnically homogeneous societies in the world, but that doesn't mean that we love each other. No, actually, in the same way that sometimes you hate your family more than you hate strangers. Yeah, we hate each other. Now it's getting better, but there's a time when these 2 particular regions, Southwest and Southeast, there were a lot of people who didn't let their children marry someone simply because the prospective partner is from the other side. Yeah? No, you don't even need to see the guy or the girl. Yeah? Oh, he's from there? No way. Yeah? They are thieves. Yeah? She's from there? No way. They are cheaters. Yeah? Yeah, and actually in the African context, the contrast between Rwanda and Tanzania are quite interesting because Rwanda, as you all know, that 25 years ago had a horrific genocide. But actually, in terms of genetics and linguistic differences, the Hutus and Tutsis are, together with Koreans, the most homogeneous group in the world. In contrast, Tanzania, which never has suffered from any ethnic conflict, if not necessarily other things, is genetically and ethnically the most diverse country in the world. But they have managed to build this sense of the nation. So actually, if you meet a Maasai from Kenya, he will usually tell you, "I'm a Maasai and then I'm from Kenya." If you meet a Maasai from Tanzania, he will say, "I'm a Tanzanian and I'm a Maasai." So basically all the other countries, they have also had to build the nation. I mean, it doesn't fall from the sky. No, there's this very interesting book written by this American historian Eugene Weber called "Peasants into Frenchmen." And this is about the kind of nation building of France in the 19th century. And he starts the book by saying that in 1840, 40% of children in French schools didn't speak any French when they entered the school because they all spoke some related language. So this idea of Frenchman had to be built through national education, newspapers, military conscriptions, political propaganda. For the sake of time, I'll skip the institutions bit. But culture, this is such a kind of easy argument. That is it is very often used as a substitute for racism. So people say, "Oh, no, I'm not a racist." Biologically we're all same, but those blacks, those Muslims, those Bangladeshis. But even if you are not talking about that kind of really negative use of the cultural argument, people making this argument don't realize that actually many of today's rich countries used to be criticized for being lazy, being lacking in sense of time, lacking in cooperation and so on, when they were poor. So until the mid-19th century, when Germany was poor, a lot of English people would go to Germany and say how lazy these people are, how dishonest these people are, how disorganized these people are, how individualistic these people are, and incapable of cooperating and so on. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, wrote in her travel journal that Germans never hurry. No, this is almost the polar opposite of our stereotypical image of the Germans as overly rational and disciplined and the organized people. So this English traveler who went to Germany in 1828, Germans are plodding, easily contented people, endowed neither with great acuteness of perception nor quickness of basically he's saying that Germans are stupid. An Australian, of all people, visiting Japan in 1915, commented that the Japanese, they cannot keep time. Now, he was actually invited by the Japanese government to advise on improving productivity in the Japanese factories. And after touring these factories, he came to the conclusion that your workers are useless. And he said, when I pointed this out to the managers, the manager said, "It's our national character." No, I mean, this sounds, almost bizarre. A Australian telling the Japanese that they are lazy. I mean, it's almost like, I don't know, a Finn going to Jamaica and saying that you are very gloomy, you know. But this is how, you know, this is not an isolated quote. Yeah? There are, I mean, even in my own writing, I have like 5, 6 like that, yeah, made by Americans, Australians, English people about the Japanese. Yeah? But, you know, the worst quote, I mean, the rudest thing that anyone has ever said about anyone else is this about my ancestors. Beatrice Webb, one of the founders of Fabian Socialism, went to my country in the early 20th century and said these are 12 millions of dirty, degraded, sullen, lazy, and religionless savages. Yeah? Well, there you go. I mean, if this was a socialist, yeah, feminist, yeah, you can imagine what other people, yeah, would have said at the time. Yeah, yeah. So we have a bit of a mystery here because every country you look at, you know, I mean, that if you know what to look for, you can find a lot of these things. Yeah, I mean, the French complaining that the Swiss do not keep time. You know, no, it's almost bizarre. Huh? But the point is that of course, when you are looking at poor foreigners, you tend to look at them in the most biased way. So there's that inherent bias. But basically, these people. These quotes that reflect the fact that economic environment shape people. Yeah? No, basically this very common trait of poor timekeeping in developing countries. It comes basically from the way of economic life. Yeah? Because if you are a farmer tilling your own land, you know, you got up late, 40 minutes late because you had a bit too much to drink last night. Yeah, you go to your field 40 minutes later, you come back 40 minutes later. Yeah? No big deal. Yeah, but if you are working in a factory on a production line, you know, everyone has to be there at 8:45. Yeah, otherwise the production line cannot run. Yeah, as you become richer, you know, time because of its absolutely limited supply. Time becomes more precious. Yeah? So basically, there's a greater pressure for timekeeping. Yeah, the great example is my own country. You know, when I was a young man in the 1980s, probably well into the mid 1990s, we had this expression called Korean time, which means you can be late for an appointment up to maybe 1.5 hours and you don't have to apologize, yeah? Because everyone is late. Yeah? What's the big deal? Yeah? Today the expression doesn't even exist. Yeah? Ask young Koreans, they haven't heard of it. Yeah, yeah, because that life is so organized. Yeah? Time is precious. Yeah? Everyone's got 3 mobile phones. Yeah? No, I mean, basically the timekeeping has been ingrained into people. Yeah? Yeah, so there are a lot of this misperception of kind of different ways of life as bad culture. Yeah? Yeah, so basically the point is that the relationship between culture and economic development is very complex. You know, it's not one-way street. Yeah, it's that economic development also affects culture, and yeah. But you know, a lot of these arguments are basically presenting, maybe deliberately, maybe because they are stupid, a very very biased picture. Yeah? Because all cultures have different elements. Yeah? Depending on how you present it, you can make a culture look very good or bad. Yeah? So actually, in my earlier book called Bad Samaritans, where I have this chapter discussing the relationship between culture and economic development, I do this what I call Jekyll and Hyde exercise for Confucianism, the East Asian culture, and Islam. Yeah? Confucianism is supposed to be good for economic development, Islam is supposed to be bad, but then I only extract elements which are supposedly good for economic development and bad for economic development, and I can show both, show that for both cultures. Yeah? I mean, I don't have time to go into that, but if you're interested, I can elaborate on it later. So, when people say, such and such culture is good for economic development, such and such culture is bad for economic development, they are basically selecting what they like. Just to give you one example, people say, the East Asian culture is good for economic development because it puts great emphasis on education. Yeah? Okay, I mean, there's that aspect, but what kind of education? Yeah, because the kind of education that used to be valued in the traditional culture is basically literature and political philosophy. Yeah, you sit for this high civil service exam, which is the way of upward social mobility, and it's all about basically testing you for Latin and Greek in this country. Yeah? So actually, there was a contempt for practical pursuit like business and engineering, and a lot had to be done to change that. Also, the changing economic environment where now businessmen and engineers were earning a lot of money. Yeah? That also contributed to change in people's perception. So it's a very complicated story, but basically, you can give a very biased picture if you just pick the right element. Yeah? Anyway, I got to conclude that so we've seen how these what I call metastructural arguments are based on very flimsy ground. I mean, it's not totally wrong, but it has some grains of truth, but packaged in a very problematic way, presented in a very biased way. But why has it become so popular to make these arguments? And my contention is that these arguments have been wheeled out because the dominant neoliberal policies imposed on the developing countries starting in the 1980s basically have failed to work. Yeah? So in the 1980s, when the developing countries had, I should go back to, when the developing countries had economic crisis, the debt crisis, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund went there, imposed what they call the structural adjustment program, basically opening up for international trade and investment, deregulating the economy, especially the financial market, privatizing state-owned enterprises, cutting government budgets, things that have been done in these countries since 2008 in Greece, in Spain. I mean, they were already done in the kind of the laboratory of the developing world in the 1980s and 90s. Yeah? And when they implemented these policies, people who were critical argued that, look, how can you impose the same policy for all countries despite them having very different conditions? Yeah? Don't you have to think about the institutions, their politics, maybe even culture? No, I mean, in the 80s it was terrible. I mean, of course, this is one of those urban legends, but they say that once this economist from the International Monetary Fund was giving a presentation in one Latin American country, let's say it's Bolivia, and page number 17 of his slides. Oops, that he forgot to change Ecuador to Bolivia. Yeah, because they were basically using the same template, plug in different numbers, give the same policies. But when people criticized this at what was derisively at the time known as the one-size-fits-all approach, the mainstream economists responded, look, economics is a science. Are you telling us that Ghana should have different physics from that is used in Germany? Are you saying that Bolivia should have a different kind of chemistry from the one that is used in the UK? Of course not. These policies come from well-received economic theory, which says trade liberalization is good, privatization is good, cutting taxes for the rich is good, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, it didn't work. In the beginning, they say, "Oh, yeah, but we need more time." I mean, how can you expect it to work in 2-3 years? We need 5 years or whatever. 5 years have passed, it still didn't work, and then they said, "Oh no, it's not because of the policies, but because of these bloody policymakers in Bangladesh and whichever country you are talking about. They are dragging their feet, So they need to do more, so they were made to do more, still didn't work. And then suddenly, in the 1990s, economies associated with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, like Paul Collier, Jeffrey Sachs, and all these people suddenly started producing all this research showing that, no, actually it's the climate, no, it's geography, it's institutions, it's culture. No, it's quite amazing. So the birth of this research agenda, which I call the ABP, that is anything but policy, came along exactly when they ran out of excuses of the failures of these policies. Because the records were terrible. The developing countries, they were growing at, in per capita terms, about 3% per year, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. During the 80s and 90s, growth basically collapsed. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa shrank at the rate of 1.1% per year. The World Bank used to complain about the bad economic policies in Latin America, but that produced still growth rate of about 3.1%. In the 80s and 90s, with all these supposedly good policies given to them by the World Bank and the IMF, growth rate was 1/4 that. Basically, there was no growth in Africa in the 80s and 90s. Since the 80s, I mean, there was a bit of pickup in growth in the 2000s, but the next decade. But since the 1980s, per capita income in Sub-Saharan Africa grew at 0.3% per year. This means that over the 36-year period, basically it was standing still. So they had to find an excuse, because there's an obvious kind of problem. You designed all these policies supposedly based on great research work by professors in Harvard, MIT, Oxford, and so on, and imposed it with huge kind of pressure. We are going to cut you off from the international capital market. We are going to cut your aid. We are going to stop giving market access unless you do these policies. Sell the family silver, sell your grandma, open up for foreign investment. Yeah, and then they have nothing to show for, and this is why suddenly things like culture, geography, climate, these things have become popular. This is not a coincidence. This is how the mainstream maintains its position. It cannot admit that we were wrong. So they have to find something that is wrong with the countries. Well, sometimes the people themselves, or at least the location. And it's all your ancestors' fault, who told them to settle down near the equator. That's why we are not developing. So somehow the policy failures have been, whitewashed. Because famous professors from Harvard and Stanford and MIT tell you that no, actually it's because of the climate. It's because of the geography. It's not because of the policies. Never. Policies can never be wrong. So this is actually quite typical of the way that the mainstream of economics have maintained its power. I mean, never admit that your policy could ever be wrong. Find a reason. No, actually, I was genuinely shocked when I was in a panel with a former high-ranking government economist who shall remain nameless because it's such a shameful story. When we were debating the causes and consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, this person was adamant that there was nothing wrong with the economic theory. No, it's all to do with these stupid civil servants who mistakenly apply the policies. It's all to do with these politicians who distorted these policies for their electoral advantage. Policy was not wrong because they were by definition based on correct theory. No, I just couldn't believe it. We just had one of the biggest financial crises based on very well-known theories. And then this person was saying that there's nothing wrong with the policy. Another occasion, a professor who is, mainstream in his approach, but known quite well for being critical of austerity policy. In some group email conversation, this person was saying, but this has nothing to do with the theory. Excuse me? How about the efficient market hypothesis? How about all these theories of the yardstick competition that were behind the privatization exercises? How about the contestable market theory, which was based behind deregulation? No, but this person was saying no. This the theory is fine. It's all to do with this stupid government officials and politicians. We have a huge mountain to climb. This is just one example. But I hope that I have help you see through some of these arguments, why they are suddenly so popular, and I hope this helps us to have a more kind of informed conversation about the global economy and the problem with economics and so on. Thank you very much.
Quick question, big one. What would your illustrious colleagues at Cambridge, how would they respond to the points you raised here? And also kind of, in terms of, you've raised a lot of points around what the issues are, but what are the solutions to this in terms of how the approach to development spending and working with developing countries change? I mean, should it be completely context driven as opposed to the way it's been done to date?
Yeah. Well, my colleagues, I mean, it really depends, you know. Some of them don't even think I'm an economist. Yeah, others would be very open to this kind of criticisms and try to find a way to deal with them. So I wouldn't generalize. Yeah? It's a rather broad spectrum, but I think probably the median response, I mean, not just my colleagues, but the whole profession would be, oh yeah, I mean, there might have been these problems, but we are already fixing them. Yeah? No, that's a very typical response about the macroeconomics, especially. Yeah? Because when you point out, look, I mean, all these macroeconomic theories, financial theories that have created the financial crisis, and yeah, a lot of them will say, oh no, but we've moved beyond. Yeah? I mean, now we are doing behavioral finance, we are doing network theory, and unfortunately, these, if they ever will, that are yet to bear fruits. Yeah, so you know, in terms of, but the dominant theory, in terms of what students are taught in the classroom, in terms of policy advices are given to the government, is basically the same. Yeah? So you know, they are trying to deflect the criticisms by pointing out some kind of marginal frontier stuff that may or may not lead to a different approach. So, well, basically when you have to defend an intellectual paradigm, there will be no shortage of clever answers. Yeah? I mean, people need to see through them. Yeah? Because a lot of people actually believe that economics has significantly changed since the financial crisis. Yeah? Because the mainstream economists have been saying, oh, we do this, we do that. Look at the work that this group in Oxford is doing and so on. Yeah, I mean, they are not lying, but you know, this is like one out of, I don't know, 1,000 people, one out of 500 people. Yeah? So you cannot point to that and say, yeah, no, we solved this problem. Yeah? So unfortunately, it's, and when it comes to policies in developing countries, well, I think the most important thing is that, I mean, you could call it contextualizing, but you know, that basically you need to develop policies that are fit for the country. Because that you know, countries are very different. Some are very large, very small. Some have the good agricultural conditions, others don't. You know, there are different stages of development. No, seriously, I mean, within the so-called developing world, there's a huge gap. You know, say Mexico, the top developing country. I mean, it's got per capita income $9,000-$10,000. You know, Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, less than 300. So basically 30 times, 30-fold gap. The gap between Mexico and the US in terms of income is only 5. So actually the gap between developing countries, I mean, probably have to use logarithmic scale, but that basically the gap between developing countries is as large, at least, as the gap between developing countries and the rich countries. So there are all these different things to consider, and indeed, I mean, when development economics was first invented in the 1940s and 50s, it was exactly on that recognition. You cannot use theories developed in the US, in the UK, in France to understand the problems of Ghana or South Korea, then or Ecuador. unfortunately, we have this global system that makes very little allowance of that. Yeah? The WTO basically requires that all countries use the same rules. Yeah? There are tiny provisions like, yes, if you are one of the least developed countries, roughly countries with less than $1,000 per capita income, you can use export subsidies that other countries cannot use. Yeah? But that's about it. Yeah? So we need to change the system because in the name of the level playing field, that basically you are forcing these unequal players to play the same game. Yeah?
And of course, taking developed countries, you could say, we have created a system which is fundamentally unsustainable, creating ecological crisis and leading to huge inequality. So we're not exactly quite an example. Can I? Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yes, give me your name and then...
Yeah, my name's Hailey. I thought that was an excellent talk. Thank you very much. I wanted to make 2 points. So, firstly, to what extent, because of these arguments, could you be saying, like with climate, there's a regression line? Have you, like someone could argue, have you just picked the points that don't land the regression line, or the countries that don't? Mm-hmm. The same with geography, Uzbekistan. There's always going to be questions after the regression line. To what extent do you think that the arguments being made in some of Acemoglu and others institutions, they've got their regression lines. To what extent do you think that's not valid? To what extent are you picking things off the regression line, or is the whole regression line like non-existent?
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, I have a problem with this statistical analysis which put structurally different countries in the same pot. Yeah? No, seriously, I mean, that regression analysis makes sense only when the underlying structural relationships between the variables in the regression are the same. Yeah? But then, as we say, that we have everyone from Switzerland to Swaziland. Yeah? Well, Swaziland has changed its name, which I can remember, so that maybe I should stop using that example. But so that there's a fundamental question with the very exercise. Yeah? And secondly, I don't know, even if you have some kind of central statistical tendency, there's a curious asymmetry between the way we discuss countries and the way we discuss individuals. Because when it comes to individuals, we are encouraged to kind of look at the outliers. Have you ever seen a biography of an ordinary mid-30s British man on an ordinary day? No. We are reading the biographies of Barack Obama, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, or maybe we read not about individuals, but that group of suffering refugees or whatever, but you don't look at the people who are exactly on the regression line. But when it comes to countries, you are all supposed to conform to that central statistical tendency. Why? No, this is quite a big methodological question, which I don't have completely worked out myself. But there's a very strange curiosity there. And in terms of even kind of advice, when it comes to individuals, that people say, oh yeah, I mean, this is basically what Disney does to brainwash children. But if you believe in yourself, you can achieve anything. But when it comes to countries, no. I mean, you all need Ghana, you all need Jamaica. What are you talking about? Don't try to do anything that these big boys are doing. Don't even try to become like the United States or Germany or Japan. You have bad culture, you have bad weather, bad climate, bad geography. There's something very strange going on there.
Right, well, okay.
It's a brilliant talk. Thank you very much. But I'm curious about, and you may already have answered, you've removed all of these excuses as to why particular nations just are not climbing up that ladder. What is holding them back?
Well, basically, I would say wrong policies, yeah? Because there are countries like my own native South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and more recently China, and before that Japan, before that Germany, United States, I mean, who have, so to speak, climbed up the ladder. Yeah? And when you look at their policies, there are a lot of commonalities. Yeah? Basically, this is summarized by the idea of the Alexander Hamilton. That's the guy you see on the $10 bill, the first ever Treasury Secretary, or what would be called the Chancellor of Exchequer in this country of the United States. Yeah? He invented this idea of infant industry protection. Yeah? Basically saying that the government of economically backward nations need to protect and nurture their young industries until they grow up and can compete in the international market. Yeah? So, that for about 120 years before the Second World War, the US had the highest tariff in the world. Yeah? Actually, before that, Britain had the highest tariff in the world. Yeah? I wrote a whole book about this called Kicking at the Ladder. Anyway, so basically these countries used policies that were suitable to their stages of development, first of all, but also their own individual conditions. Yeah? So Singapore, it didn't have protectionism, yeah? But it was far more interventionist than Japan or Korea, which had quite high protectionism in other senses. Yeah? 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government. 85% of housing is supplied by the government-owned housing corporation. Yeah? So it was in recognition that as a city-state with kind of urban concentration, unless we control the housing problem, we don't even have basis for stable society. Yeah, so you do that, but then in recognition of the fact that you lack indigenous entrepreneurial class, and you have a small domestic market, you basically decide to allow a lot of foreign investment and free trade, while also maintaining control of the core of the economy by having lots of state-owned enterprises. Singapore's state-owned enterprises that produce something like 22% of GDP, one of the highest in the world, even including the oil states. So, you basically have to use policies that are suitable for your conditions, stages of development, your market size, and so on. In the last 3-4 decades, developing countries have been prevented from doing that. First, there was the so-called structural adjustment programs, and then came the WTO, came all sorts of formal and informal pressures to follow the so-called Washington Consensus. So, I would say that is the key answer. Yeah, of course, when you look at individual countries, some of them have civil wars and some of them have natural disasters. You cannot explain everything with policies, but at least that is anything but policy. That is not the answer.
I might just to follow up, at a sort of deeper level, would you say, because there must have been people who understood that the policies in some sense weren't going to work, and do you think it's actually in the interests of certain classes or positions or power of the developed countries for developing countries to fail in some sense, in terms of being able to still extract a sort of colonization or keeping a sort of colonization system going? Yeah,
sure. Of course, in looking at this big kind of, if you like, epochal changes, you cannot explain it with all one kind of cause. So there were different motives, yeah. Yeah, so there were people who genuinely believed that because these are scientific theories, scientific policies, they should work, yeah. There were people who were doing it even knowing that it's not going to work for the country, but it's good for your country, your corporations, yeah, your class of people. Yeah. It wasn't just externally imposed, because internally there were a lot of people in the developing countries, some factions of the elite who actually wanted this. Yeah. Never mind the country is not going to grow. Yeah. But by working as, if you like, middleman for the foreign corporations, you are going to be richer. Yeah? So, you know, there are a lot of conflicting motives there. Yeah? So, yes, I mean, there was certainly some of what you said. Yeah.
Because we impose austerity on our own people as well, or part. You know,
yeah, I mean,
people,
that's right. Yeah, but you know, austerity is good for some people. Yeah.
Yeah.
The financial sector, mostly, but yeah.
Now you would say.
That's really interesting. I wondered if any of your reading of the history of how the stereotypical national character has changed over the years has led you to any understanding of what factors led to those changes and whether they might be appropriate now, in particular institutions. Are they the result of different institutions becoming stronger?
That's right, yeah. So, yeah, there are a lot of things going on here. I mean, I had to simplify, but yeah. So, first of all, there's the changes in your material life that change your, not just your behavior, but also your way of thinking, your motivation. Also, there are kind of institutional changes that change people. Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you that personal example. When I first moved to this country as a graduate student back in 1986, I made this Swedish friend, who claimed to be right-wing, pro-market, and he was going on and on about how the Social Democratic Party has ruined Sweden. Yeah? And at that point, my knowledge of Sweden consisted essentially of Pippi Longstocking, so I didn't have a clue what this guy was saying. Yeah? So I asked him, Anders, which was his name, what are you talking about? How did your Social Democratic Party ruin your country, and how do you think it needs to be fixed? Yeah? And he said, this government takes more than 50% of GDP in tax. Yeah? It's close to 55. Yeah? This has to stop. Yeah? It should be brought down to 45. Yeah? And I told him, Anders, you are going to get arrested for being a communist if you went to South Korea. At the time, South Korea had the right-wing military dictatorship. I mean, they achieved great things in industrialization, but one thing they didn't want to do was expand the welfare state. Yeah? So at the time, the Korean government was taking not even 15% of GDP in tax. Yeah? And a lot of right-wingers complained that this is too high. Yeah, so advocating 45%, he would have been arrested and put in jail in South Korea at the time. Yeah? But having grown up in Sweden, he couldn't imagine a world where kind of pro-market government was not taking at least 45% of GDP in tax. Yeah? So those institutions of welfare state shaped his worldview. Yeah? And then there are more kind of immediate campaigns. Yeah? So a lot of, although these are not as effective as the other ones, yeah? But every little helps, as Tesco says. Yeah? And a lot of countries have tried to encourage timekeeping and things like that, but unfortunately that isn't all that effective. And when I visited one developing country which will remain nameless, I was told that their last president was very keen on timekeeping, and he even organized this national rally for timekeeping, for which he was 1.5 hours late. Yeah? So these surface level persuasions, I mean, are not useless, but much less effective than institutional changes and changes in material conditions.
Yeah, on culture and development, I very much agree with you that obviously we cannot say that economic development is sort of predetermined by culture, with countries with bad cultural traits being predestined for underdevelopment. But isn't there any risk with some form of determinism running also the other way around? So in terms of thinking of culture as being predetermined by economic structure, by level of development and so on, isn't there a space for some irreducible cultural heterogeneity? What your views were on this, and also in your view, what is the cause of the growth acceleration experienced in the developing world starting about year 2000?
Yeah, on the first one, of course it's a perennial debate in not just economics but social sciences in general. I mean the tension between the structure and agency. So, my view is that you need to look at both, because that social scientists in their pursuit to be systematic tend to lean towards that structural determinism. Even mainstream economics, which keeps talking about choice, there's really no real choice in the mainstream neoclassical economics, because people are supposed to be rational. And what is rational is determined by the underlying structure. So actually, you are just the carrier of the structure. You are not making a real choice. So only when actually we reject that people are rational, we can talk about real choice. And in the real world, the world is changed by people who make choices that are not obvious. No, even entrepreneurs. These are by definition people who are doing things that everyone else think are going to fail. No, because if the others knew that it was going to succeed, someone would have already done it. So in the real world, agency is very important. But in theory, because once you introduce agency, I mean, it's the result becomes indeterminate. So you tend to lean towards the structural determinism. And yes, I mean, that kind of the structural determinism about culture is very typical of Marxist economics. I mean, it's great in many ways, but in that respect, it was absurd. Basically, your economic base determines your superstructure, including your ideology. But then, if everyone is determined by the ideology, how does the world change? Anyway, so it's a difficult job to pull off in practice. In theory, you can always say, it's a two-way, but in practice, that really requires very careful crafting to get it right. On the other point, I mean, the growth acceleration, a lot of that was basically driven by China. So the Chinese started sucking in huge amount of raw materials from developing countries. And countries like Brazil actually went in the kind of wrong direction towards primary production during that period, because the government was neglecting to promote infant industries under the influence of neoliberalism, but more importantly, the pull of China was so strong that resources flowed into growing soybeans and digging the iron ore, because that's where the money was. Why live a difficult life of trying to make the manufacturing product that can compete with the Chinese ones when you can just dig up iron ore and grow soybeans and earn more money. So actually when the Chinese growth started slowing down, growth in a lot of developing countries started coming down too. So I mean, I haven't done quantitative analysis of this, so I cannot tell you exactly how important it was, but I think that a lot of it can be explained by the China effect.
So China's good policies.
Sorry?
So China's good policies.
Yeah, good
it's mass
for
pooling
themselves, but maybe not necessarily good for countries like Brazil because it drove them in the wrong direction. Yeah, but also in Africa, some of it is explained by the end of these civil wars. Yeah, I mean a lot of African countries, partly because of the economic collapse, were in civil war in Africa in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of these kind of came to an end in the 2000s, you know, the Chad, yeah, sorry, Uganda, Rwanda, you know. So, of course, I mean, there were new conflicts like in Cote d'Ivoire and so on, but, you know, in general, the continent that became more peaceful, so there was that dividend, and yeah, there were countries that found basically oil during that period. Yeah? Angola, you know, Equatorial Guinea, Ghana found oil, although it's not in full production yet. Yeah? So, yeah, it was a mixture of factors, but I think China factor was very important. Yeah?
And actually, there is an article about Brazil in the last issue of the Mint about suggesting that Bolsonaro has effectively come out of the fact that Brazil, the previous government, bet on China continuing forever.
That's right.
And of course, then it all came crashing down.
Yeah.
Well, given this, can we ever have a world where all countries are equally as rich?
Well,
Is
not
that possible?
in my lifetime. No, but seriously, why not? Yeah. No, because if you go back far enough, I mean, at least in absolute terms, all countries are poor. Yeah? So, you know, in the last 250 years, the significant number of countries have become rich. Yeah, yeah, there'll always be richer countries and poorer countries, but yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I mean, if we survive this climate crisis, yeah, keeping my fingers crossed, it is possible to have a world where everyone is, yeah, I mean, materially well off, yeah. Of course, for various reasons, this is not going to happen anytime soon, yeah. And rich countries don't want competitors, yeah. A lot of them still have this misguided idea about, yeah, there being something wrong with, these developing countries, especially their people, and yeah, the global rules need changing and so on. But yes, I mean, you know, in absolute terms, I don't see why we cannot live in a world where everyone is well off. You know?
Well, I think we might. You got a small question?
Yeah, one last question.
One last question.
Okay, I'll try and make it small. So I think that I wanted to kind of get your view on what you think of in relation with China and Africa, but maybe that's for a bit later. But I think the quick question is around, like, where does this kind of leave us for policy in terms of, like, you know, if the poorer countries effectively know what is right for them, what business do richer countries have in kind of like helping them or benevolent? I'm just a bit confused as to where the role is for the rich countries to kind of play in this.
Yeah. Well, on China question, you know, as a good Korean whose country has been bullied by everyone in the neighborhood, you know, and beyond, you know, China, Japan, you know, Mongolia, Manchuria, you know, Russia, the United States. I don't like any big country. No, seriously, I mean. That in our school textbook, that we learned that in 2000 something years of recorded history, we were invaded some ridiculous number like 1,450 times, almost every year. Yeah, so I don't like any of these big countries, but you know, at the moment, China is a positive force because at least it provides some leverage to the other developing countries in negotiating with the traditional, rich countries. Yeah. No, because in the 80s and 90s, why did so many countries follow this so-called Washington Consensus policies? Because there was only one bank in town called the World Bank, and if you didn't like what they offered, there was nowhere else to go. Now you at least have Chinese-led international infrastructural bank, or is it Asian infrastructure bank? You have the Latin American Banco do Sur, you have these alternatives, At least that you can now say, well, if you are not nice to us, we are going to go and talk to the Chinese, It's a real threat, Whereas in the 90s, they'll say, good luck, talk to the Chinese, talk to anyone, because there's no one to talk to, So I think for the moment is a positive thing, but who knows? I mean, in 20, 30 years' time, China will be as nasty as the Americans. I don't know. I wouldn't count on it. But your second question, sorry. Basically, well, I think a lot of countries don't quite know what they have to do, because they've been brainwashed by the World Bank and the IMF, and the rich countries into believing that, free trade is always good. We have to welcome foreign investors. Shouldn't put any conditions on it. Ideally, you have to privatize everything. So a lot of policymakers in the developing countries today actually believe in these things. So that's the first obstacle. Now there are people, of course, who don't believe in it and try to do different things, but then there is the constraint of the WTO and other global structures. So it's going to be a struggle, but on the other hand, I think there's a lot more kind of awareness and willingness on the part of developing country policymakers these days. I've been, always involved in policymaking in the developing world, despite being an academic. I mean, not as if I went to work for some government, but I talked to a lot of the policymakers from across the world, and even compared to say 10 years ago, there's a lot of awareness that these policies that we have been told are the best policies are actually not working. We need to try different things. We need to think about economic development in a different way. So I think I'm hopeful.
That's a good point to end. Thank you.